The afternoon my daughter told me she needed my house, I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug I had already washed once. That's something I do sometimes. Wash dishes twice. Not because they're dirty, just because the rhythm settles my mind. The window above the sink faces the backyard. There's an old maple tree back there that my husband planted sometime in the late 90s. I don't remember the exact year anymore. I just remember him standing there with a shovel saying, "Give it 20 years and we'll have real shade." He was right about that. The tree was casting long shadows across the yard when Tessa walked into the kitchen. She didn't knock. She rarely does. She has always moved through rooms, as if the space already belonged to her. Brent followed behind her, carrying a stainless steel travel mug and looking around in that quiet way he has when he's studying a place. I dried my hands on a towel and said hello. No one answered right away. Tessa stood at the kitchen island, running her fingers slowly along the edge of the granite, like she was measuring something invisible. Then she said it. "Mom, we need your house for the kids. Not, could we talk about it? Not, have you ever considered? Just a sentence, direct, clean. Already decided." For a moment I wondered if I had misunderstood her. The kitchen felt unusually quiet. Even the refrigerator hum sounded louder than usual. I looked at her carefully. "I'm sorry," I said. "You need my house." She nodded, as if the logic should already be obvious. "The kids are getting older," she said. "They need stability, more space." Brent leaned against the counter and took a sip from his mug. Neither of them looked uncomfortable. That's when I noticed something small. Tessa had brought a folder. Thin, blue, sitting quietly on the island between us. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. I pulled out a chair and sat down. "You already have a house," I said. "It's small," she replied quickly. "You chose it. We were younger then." Her voice carried that careful patience adult children sometimes use when they believe they're explaining something obvious to an aging parent. Brent finally spoke. "This place just makes more sense," he said. "More sense." That phrase stayed with me. I looked slowly around my kitchen. 40 years of mornings started in that room. Christmas dinners, birthday cakes cooling on the counter. The night Tessa came home from college and cried at this same table because she had failed a chemistry exam. Memories don't make much sense on paper, but they still belong somewhere. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said. Tessa slid the blue folder slightly closer. "Nothing complicated," she said. "Just paperwork." That was the word she used. Just paperwork. At 66 years old, I've learnt something about paperwork. Paper isn't the problem. Power is. Brent opened the folder. I caught a glimpse of typed pages. Legal formatting. Paragraphs with numbered clauses. "The house could transfer to us," Tessa explained. "For practical reasons." "Practical reasons. You'd still live here," she added quickly. There was a small pause in the room. That's when the room went quiet. I noticed Brent watching my reaction very carefully. People sometimes mistake silence for confusion, but silence can also be observation. And I've spent most of my life observing. I stood up slowly and walked back to the sink. Outside, the maple leaves were shifting in the wind. "I'll think about it," I said. Tessa's shoulders relaxed immediately. She thought the conversation had moved in her direction. Brent closed the folder. "Good," he said. Then he added something that felt casual at the time. "Things are easier when families plan ahead." Plan ahead. That phrase sat in the air like a document waiting to be signed. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands again. Then I looked at both of them. And that's when a thought arrived quietly in my mind. Not anger, not panic, just clarity. Some people mistake silence for permission. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even open the folder. Instead, I did something much simpler. I started paying attention. And once you start paying attention to paperwork, people, and timing, you begin to notice things others assume you won't. Like the folder sitting calmly on my kitchen counter, or the way Brent kept glancing toward the hallway cabinet where I store my documents, or the fact that Tessa already seemed certain the house would eventually belong to them. That afternoon ended politely. They stayed for dinner. We talked about school schedules and grocery prices, but something had shifted in my kitchen, not visibly, just structurally, and structures matter. Later that night, after they left, I opened a small notebook I keep in my study. I wrote down the date. Then I wrote one sentence. Tessa asked for the house today. I paused for a moment. Then I added something else. She brought paperwork. At the time, it felt like a small detail. Later, it became the first piece of evidence. Because when situations begin to change, procedure matters more than emotion. And that evening, very quietly, I made a decision. If they were planning something, I would let the process unfold, but I would document every step of it. And that was the moment the story truly began. The next morning, I woke up at 5:42. That's early, even for me. I remember the clock clearly because I lay there for a few seconds watching the red numbers glow in the dark before getting out of bed. Not because I was upset exactly. It was more that my mind had already started organizing things. What had been said, what had been implied, what had already been prepared. Strangely enough, the blue folder stayed with me longer than the sentence did. I got up, made coffee in the old stainless steel percolator I've used for years, and waited for the soft clicking sound it makes when the water starts moving through the grounds. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen slowly, the way it always does. Outside, the yard was still grey. With early morning light, the maple tree looked almost black against the sky. I carried my mug into the study and opened the hallway cabinet first. Nothing looked disturbed. Insurance binder in the back, property tax file in the left drawer, the deed copy still resting in the manila envelope where I had always kept it. Still, I moved the envelope, not far, just from the cabinet to the locking drawer in my desk. At the time, that didn't feel dramatic. Later, I realized I had already begun adjusting the structure of things. Around noon, Tessa sent a text. Hope you're thinking about what we discussed. This would help everyone. Help everyone. That phrase sat on the screen longer than it needed to. It's interesting how often people use that expression when only one person is expected to make the sacrifice. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I went out to the garage. There's an old red storage bin out there where I keep photo albums, tax files, and a few pieces of paperwork. I've never quite had the heart to throw away. The lid creaked slightly when I opened it. It smelled like cardboard, dust, and the faint dry scent of fallen leaves. I moved the albums aside until I found the accordion folder holding the old mortgage documents, refinance paperwork, insurance riders, closing statements from years ago. The kind of paperwork people forget exists until they suddenly need it. As I stood there flipping through the file, a memory came back to me so clearly it almost startled me. Tessa was 8 years old, maybe 9. It had rained hard that afternoon, one of those sudden summer storms that floods the sidewalks and turns the gutters into small rivers. She burst through the mudroom door laughing, soaked from the knees down. I knelt on the floor, trying to pull off her rubber boots while she twisted and laughed. "Hold still," I told her. "I am holding still," she said, while doing the exact opposite. The boots made that damp suction sound when they finally came off. Wet socks, mud on the tile, the smell of rain and denim. I remember looking up at her and saying, "One day you're going to understand that houses don't take care of themselves." She grinned. "Then I'll live with you forever." At the time, it was funny. Standing in the garage years later, holding mortgage paperwork, the memory landed differently. I closed the storage bin and carried the accordion file inside. That afternoon, Brent came by alone. That was new. He knocked once and then opened the screen door before I reached it. Not aggressively. just familiar enough to suggest he assumed I wouldn't mind. He stood on the porch holding his travel mug again. "I was in the area," he said. "People say that when they want access without explanation." I stepped aside and let him in. He walked slowly through the living room, his eyes moving over the staircase, the fireplace, the hallway. "I've always liked the layout here," he said. I didn't respond. He turned and gave me a small smile. "Tessa worries about you being here alone." There it was, not the house first. My situation. My vulnerability, my suitability for ownership. I sat down in the armchair near the window. "I'm not alone," I said. "I live alone?" He nodded slowly, like we were discussing a technical detail. "Sure," he said. "But there's a difference." That was the first real pressure moment. Not loud, not hostile, just a quiet attempt to redefine the situation. He stayed maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15. Long enough to circle the same point several different ways. Maintenance, stairs, future planning, liability. Words that sound responsible when spoken calmly. When he left, I watched his truck reverse slowly down the driveway. Then I went back to my study and opened the notebook. Date. Time. Brent visit. Phrase used. "Tessa worries about you being here alone." Seeing it written down made it look smaller than it had felt in the room. That's the useful thing about documentation. It removes performance and leaves only language. 2 days later, I went to book club. Clara hosts it most months. She lives 3 streets over, in a white ranch house with an overwatered lawn, and wind chimes she insists are tasteful. 6 of us gathered in her living room that afternoon. Books stacked on the coffee table, teacups balanced on saucers. Clara had made lemon bars, Naomi brought pistachios. Someone's perfume smelled faintly like gardenia. Halfway through a discussion about a novel none of us particularly liked, Clara glanced toward me. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I paused. "With what?" She hesitated. Then she looked down at her teacup. "Oh, I just meant... Tessa mentioned you've seemed a little overwhelmed lately." Overwhelmed. That word landed softly in the room, but it landed. I smiled. "I'm perfectly fine," I said. Clara nodded too quickly. "Yes, of course. I just thought, you know how daughters worry." I did know. And I also knew when a narrative had begun moving ahead of me. That evening, I stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, looking at the spot on the counter where the blue folder had rested. Then another memory surfaced. Tessa was 16. Standing at the same counter, wearing a denim jacket. She was furious, because I wouldn't let her go to Chicago for a weekend with friends I didn't know. Her hand slammed against the counter so hard the sugar bowl rattled. "You never trust me," she said. I was stirring tomato soup on the stove. Basil. Too much garlic. I remember turning off the burner and saying, "Trust isn't the issue. Procedure is." She rolled her eyes dramatically. "It's always procedure with you." At the time, I had laughed. Standing in my kitchen years later, I didn't laugh. Because in a way, she had been right. It was always procedure with me. And maybe that was the reason I was still standing in my own house. The following Monday, something small happened. Small enough that someone younger might have dismissed it. I logged into my online banking account and noticed a verification alert tied to my homeowner's insurance autopay. The payment had still processed, but the contact phone number on file had been changed. I didn't recognize the number. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I called the bank. A woman named Denise answered. Her voice was calm and professional. She verified my identity and checked the account. "It appears a secondary contact number was added through a linked household inquiry," she said. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Usually a family member attempting to assist with profile standardization." "Assist," another carefully chosen word. "Remove it," I said. She did, then she paused. Would you like me to add a note requiring direct verbal confirmation from you before any future account changes? The suggestion felt almost procedural. Yes, I said. Please add that note. When I hung up, I didn't feel frightened. I felt confirmed. The house conversation had moved beyond conversation. It had entered systems. And once things enter systems, emotion becomes irrelevant. Procedure becomes everything. That night, I made grilled cheese and tomato soup, the simple kind from a carton. I ate at the kitchen table with my notebook open beside me. Then another memory surfaced. Hospital cafeteria. Plastic spoon scraping the bottom of a paper bowl. It was during the last year of my husband's illness. We were sitting across from each other under fluorescent lights, waiting for discharge instructions that kept getting delayed. He lifted his coffee cup and said quietly, "If anything ever happens, don't let people rush you." I asked, "Rush me where?" He smiled faintly. "Into decisions that benefit them." The smell of disinfectant hung in the air. Someone dropped a tray 2 tables away. I remember asking him, "Is that advice or a warning?" He looked at me for a moment and said, "Both." Back in my kitchen years later, I set my spoon down. Grief changes shape over time. Sometimes it's sorrow, sometimes it's instruction. By Tuesday morning, I had made a decision. Not about the house, about the process. I called a real estate attorney in the next county. Not someone in town, not someone Tessa might know. A man named Daniel Hargrove answered the phone. I explained the situation. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked a simple question. "Have you signed anything?" "No." A short pause. "Good," he said. "Come see me Thursday." For the first time since the blue folder appeared in my kitchen, the ground felt steady again. Not because the problem had disappeared, because the process had finally begun on my side of the table. And once that happened, everything started to change. Thursday morning arrived cool and grey, the kind of quiet Midwestern morning where the sky seems undecided about whether it intends to rain. I left the house a little before 9. Not in a hurry, just early enough to give myself time to think while driving. Daniel Hargrove's office was about 40 minutes away, in a smaller county seat town where most of the buildings still had brick facades and narrow sidewalks. The courthouse sat at the center of the square like it had been there forever. On one corner, there was a bakery that smelled strongly of cinnamon and butter, even from the street. Across from it stood a hardware store with dusty windows and hand-painted signs. Daniel's office was above a title company. 2nd floor. No elevator. The wooden staircase creaked slightly as I climbed it. Inside, the waiting room looked ordinary in a way I found reassuring. 2 leather chairs, a small table stacked with magazines from last year, and a framed photograph of a lake somewhere in Michigan. A woman at the desk looked up and smiled. "You must be Martha," she said. I nodded. "Daniel will be right with you." I sat down and watched a small particle of dust drift slowly through the sunlight coming from the window. It's strange what you notice when you're waiting. The clicking of the receptionist's keyboard, the low hum of a printer somewhere down the hall, the faint smell of coffee drifting through the office. At the time, I didn't feel nervous. Mostly, I felt curious. About 10 minutes later, a door opened and Daniel Hargrove stepped out. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s maybe. Brown hair starting to grey near the temples. Navy suit without a tie. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Keene." "Martha is fine," I said. He nodded once. "Come on in." His office was smaller than I expected, but very orderly. Shelves of legal books along one wall. 2 framed diplomas. A large wooden desk that looked older than both of us. He didn't rush the conversation. That was the first thing I noticed. Some professionals rush to fill silence. Daniel didn't. He simply waited while I explained everything. The kitchen conversation, the blue folder, Brent's visit, Clara mentioning I seemed overwhelmed, the phone number change on my bank account. He listened carefully. occasionally writing something down on a yellow legal pad. When I finished speaking, he leaned back slightly in his chair. Then he asked something I hadn't expected. "Do you feel safe in your home?" The question sat in the room for a moment. I thought about it carefully. "Yes," I said. Then I added something that surprised even me. "But I don't feel secure." He nodded slowly. "That distinction matters," he said. He wrote something else on the legal pad. Then he folded his hands. "What your daughter is doing," he said calmly, "is beginning a capacity narrative." I hadn't heard the phrase before. "A capacity narrative," I repeated. "Yes," he leaned forward slightly. "In legal disputes involving property, one party sometimes attempts to establish that the owner is gradually becoming incapable of managing their affairs." He paused. "They rarely begin with accusations. Instead, they start with words. Overwhelmed, concerned, forgetful." He tapped the legal pad lightly with his pen. "Then small actions appear. Phone number changes. Medical appointments suggested. Friends hearing about your supposed stress." I felt something settle in my chest. Not fear, recognition. "That's exactly what's happening," I said. Daniel nodded. "It often is." He stood up and walked toward the bookshelf. He pulled down a thick binder and placed it on the desk. "Let me show you something." He opened the binder and flipped through several pages. Then he turned it toward me. "These are the guardianship statutes," he said. His finger rested on a paragraph near the center. "Guardianship petitions require evidence, medical documentation, behavioral testimony, witness statements." Then he pointed to another line. "But here's the important part." His finger paused on the sentence. "Until a court determines incapacity, the property owner retains full authority over their assets." I read the sentence twice. Then I looked up. "So they can't take the house," I said. "Not yet," he replied. "Not yet." Those two words carried more weight than the rest of the conversation. The lawyer looked up and paused. Then he added something else. "However, timing matters." He closed the binder. "If a guardianship petition is filed and supported by preliminary documentation, a court can temporarily freeze certain property actions." Freeze. That word changed the shape of the conversation in my mind. "So if they file first," I said slowly. He nodded. Things become more complicated. The room grew quiet. Then Daniel spoke again. "You have several options." He explained them carefully. "Protective filings, independent medical evaluation from a physician I choose, creation of a trust structure." Then he mentioned something else, almost casually. "You could sell the house." The idea entered the room quietly. "Sell it, not to them, to someone else." "If the asset no longer exists in your possession," he continued, "there is nothing left to contest. The leverage disappears." I stared at the wood grain of his desk. Outside the window, a truck passed slowly along the street. I heard the low rumble of the engine. "Would that look extreme?" I asked. Daniel shook his head slightly. "Only to people who expected control." That sentence stayed with me. Only to people who expected control. He slid a blank notepad toward me. "If you choose that route, we move quietly. Private sale, no public listing, limited disclosure, quiet." I realized something in that moment. I didn't feel cornered. I felt positioned. The meeting lasted about 40 minutes. When I stood to leave, Daniel handed me a folder. Inside were summaries of the legal options we discussed. On the top page, he had written one sentence in blue ink. "Procedure protects clarity." I thanked him and walked back down the creaking staircase. Outside, the sky had brightened slightly. The bakery on the corner was putting fresh trays in the window. The smell of cinnamon drifted across the sidewalk. I stood beside my car for a moment, thinking. Not about revenge. Not about confrontation. About structure. When I drove home, I noticed something unusual halfway down my street. A silver sedan parked near my driveway. engine running. I recognized it immediately. Tessa. She was sitting in the driver's seat, Brent beside her. When I pulled into the driveway, both of them stepped out. The timing felt deliberate. "We were hoping to catch you," Tessa said. I shut off the engine and stepped out of the car. "What's going on?" I asked. Brent crossed his arms. "We've been doing some research." Research, another procedural word. Tessa stepped closer. "Mom, we think it would help if you met with someone." I already knew the sentence before she finished. A doctor. There it was, the institutional pivot. Not just family pressure anymore, documentation, evidence. Brent added quietly, "Just to make sure everything is still stable." The air between us felt thinner. I looked at both of them carefully. Then I remembered the sentence Daniel had shown me in the binder. Until a court determines incapacity, the property owner retains full authority. "I'll choose my own doctor," I said. The reaction was immediate. Brent frowned slightly. Tessa blinked. "That's not what we meant," she said quickly. "Of course it is," I replied. A long pause followed. Then Brent spoke. "If you refuse, things could become complicated." Complicated, another pressure word. But something had shifted inside me. Procedure was no longer theirs alone. I opened the car door and picked up Daniel's folder. Then I looked back at them. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly. "But the process has already started." Brent's expression flickered. Tessa looked confused. "What process?" she asked. I closed the car door gently. "You'll see," I said. And for the first time since the blue folder appeared in my kitchen, uncertainty moved to their side of the conversation. When I told them the process had already started, neither of them spoke right away. You could almost see the recalculation happening. Tessa looked down at the folder in my hand, as if it might contain something explosive. "What process?" she asked again. Her voice had lost some of that careful patience she usually used with me. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked past them, unlocked the front door, and stepped into the house. They followed. That too was familiar. Inside, the kitchen looked exactly the way it always had. Afternoon light fell across the counter in long pale rectangles. The maple tree outside moved slowly in the breeze. Brent stood near the island. Tessa remained closer to the doorway. "I met with an attorney this morning," I said. No drama, just a sentence. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Tessa's shoulders stiffened. "You hired a lawyer?" she asked. "I consulted one." "For what?" "For clarity." The word landed harder than I expected. Brent rubbed the back of his neck and looked around the kitchen again. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I did," I replied. There was a brief silence. Then Tessa laughed softly, the way people do when they're trying to make something sound unreasonable. "Mom," she said, "we're family." Family. The word didn't feel quite the same anymore. I set Daniel's folder on the counter. "Family can still disagree about procedure," I said. Brent stepped forward slightly. "What exactly did this lawyer tell you?" "That, until a court determines incapacity," I said calmly, "the property owner retains full authority over their assets." The sentence felt heavier spoken aloud. More formal, more real. Tessa blinked. Why would incapacity even be part of this conversation? That question stayed suspended between us. Then I said quietly, "You scheduled a medical evaluation." Neither of them answered, which was answer enough. Brent finally spoke. "That was just precaution." Precaution. Another carefully chosen word. "I'll choose my own doctor," I repeated. Then I picked up the folder again and carried it into the study, not to hide it, just to end the conversation. They didn't stay long after that. Brent said something about thinking things through. Tessa avoided looking toward the hallway cabinet where my documents used to sit. When their car finally pulled away, I walked back into the kitchen and sat down, not exhausted, just aware. Something structural had shifted. That evening I called Daniel. I think they're preparing a guardianship narrative, I told him. He didn't sound surprised. That usually happens after the first consultation, he said. After? Yes, he replied. People who expect control often accelerate when they sense resistance. Accelerate. The word felt accurate. What do we do next? I asked. He paused for a moment. Then he said, We move faster. That was the moment the escalation truly began. The next 2 weeks unfolded along two different paths. One financial, one social. They overlapped in ways I hadn't anticipated. The financial lane began quietly. Daniel connected me with a real estate agent who specialized in private transactions. Her name was Carla. We met at a coffee shop in the neighboring county on a Tuesday morning. She arrived exactly on time. Mid-40s, short, dark hair. A notebook already open when I sat down. Daniel had clearly briefed her. I understand discretion matters, she said. That's correct. No public listing, she continued. No yard signs, no online photos. Qualified buyers only. I nodded. The smell of espresso drifted through the cafe. Outside, a delivery truck beeped while backing into the alley. Carla leaned slightly closer. Your home will sell quickly, she said. It's in a strong district. Strong district. Another procedural phrase. What timeline are you considering? She asked. I thought about Daniel's earlier warning. Timing matters. As soon as possible, I said. She nodded once. I'll arrange a private showing this week. That became the first evidence step. Quiet, contained, logged in Carla's notebook. Later that afternoon, I returned home and began preparing the house. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments. I moved a stack of mail off the kitchen table, straightened the bookshelf in the study, wiped fingerprints from the refrigerator handle. Those small actions felt strangely calming, almost like resetting a stage before the next scene. The social lane began the following day. I noticed it first through Clara again. She called around noon. Martha, she said gently. I heard something concerning. I leaned against the kitchen counter. What did you hear? Tessa mentioned you might be selling the house. The room went quiet, not because the information surprised me, because it confirmed something else. My daughter had already begun shaping the narrative. I haven't listed it, I said carefully. Clara hesitated. She seemed worried you were acting quickly. Worried? Concern is a powerful social tool. I thanked Clara for letting me know and ended the call. Then I wrote the conversation in my notebook. Date, time, phrase used, acting quickly. Evidence logged. 2 hours later, Carla arrived for the showing. A quiet couple from another county walked through the house with her. They moved slowly, respectfully. The man paused in the living room and ran his hand along the window frame. Solid wood, he said. His wife smiled as she stepped into the kitchen. It feels peaceful here. Peaceful. That word almost made me laugh. Because the peace in that house had been anything but simple lately. Carla took notes as they moved from room to room. Another quiet documentation step. When they left, she turned to me. They're serious buyers, she said. That's good. She nodded. You may have an offer within days. Days. The timeline was tightening. 2 evenings later, Tessa came by again. This time, she didn't bring Brent. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded. Mom, she said, are you selling the house? I didn't invite her in immediately. Instead, I stepped out onto the porch. The evening air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. I'm considering options, I said. Her expression hardened. You're doing this out of spite. No, I replied. I'm doing this out of procedure. She shook her head slowly. You're making a huge mistake. Maybe. But mistakes and authority are two different things. She stepped closer. You can't just erase the future we planned. That sentence landed harder than she intended, because it revealed the assumption underneath everything. They believed the future already belonged to them. I looked directly at her. Escrow doesn't recognize assumptions, I said. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she said quietly, "You're choosing strangers over family." I didn't answer that, because the answer wasn't simple, and complexity rarely improves arguments. She left shortly after that. The next morning, Carla called. "We have an offer," she said. "Cash. Fast closing." My hands trembled slightly as I held the phone. Not from fear. From the scale of the decision, selling the house would remove the asset entirely, which meant something important. The guardianship narrative would collapse, because there would be nothing left to control. I drove to Daniel's office again that afternoon. The same creaking staircase. The same quiet waiting room. He reviewed the offer carefully. Then he looked up. "This is clean," he said. "Do we move forward?" I thought about the maple tree, the kitchen table, the hallway Brent had studied. Then I thought about the blue folder and the medical appointment I had never requested. "Yes," I said. He slid the contract toward me. Closing could happen within 3 weeks. 3 weeks. That meant one thing. We needed silence. No announcements, no signals, just procedure moving quietly forward. As I left his office, Daniel added one more thing. "Once this closes," he said, "the entire structure changes." I understood exactly what he meant, because the house was no longer just a home. It had become leverage, and that leverage was about to disappear. That night I stood in my kitchen again, the same counter, the same window, the maple tree moving slowly outside. I ran my hand across the surface of the table. Then I whispered something quietly to myself. "You can't take what was never yours." The sentence felt simple, but it would soon become the turning point of everything that followed. The offer moved forward faster than I expected. Carla called the next morning to say the buyers had already completed their preliminary review. Cash purchase. No contingencies beyond a brief inspection and title confirmation. Daniel explained what that meant in practical terms. Escrow could open immediately, he said. I was sitting at my kitchen table while he spoke, my phone resting against my ear and my notebook open in front of me. Outside, the maple tree was shedding small yellow leaves that drifted slowly across the yard. "Once escrow opens," Daniel continued, "the timeline becomes predictable." Predictable. I've always liked that word. Procedure works best when things are predictable. "What's the closing date?" I asked. "Possibly 3 weeks," he said. "Maybe sooner if the title clears quickly." 3 weeks. That meant one thing. We had to remain quiet. No signals, no explanations. Just paperwork moving through systems. Escrow opened the next day. The confirmation email arrived at 10:18 inches the morning. I remember the exact time because I stared at the subject line for several seconds before opening it. Escrow, file, initiated, another procedural step, logged, saved, filed. Later that afternoon, the social lane accelerated again. Tessa called. Her voice sounded sharper than usual. "Mom, we need to talk." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "About what?" Brent spoke to someone about property records. There it was. The system had moved faster than she expected. "Records are public," I said. "You're actually selling the house," she said. "Not a question." A realization. "Yes." Silence followed. Then her voice rose slightly. "You can't do that." I glanced at the escrow email still open on my laptop. "Actually," I said calmly, "I can." Another pause. Then Brent's voice appeared faintly in the background. "Put it on speaker." Tessa inhaled sharply. "You're doing this to punish us," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm doing this to protect myself." The tone on the other end of the call shifted. "You're being manipulated," Brent said. That sentence almost made me smile. Because there was no manipulator, just procedure. "By who?" I asked. Neither of them answered. After the call ended, I opened my notebook and wrote 2 lines. Phone call escalation. Phrase used. You can't do that. Then I closed the notebook and made myself tea. 2 days later, something else happened. The county clerk's office called. A polite woman named Rebecca. She was verifying a routine detail connected to the title file. Just confirming there are no pending legal claims tied to the property, she said. No claims, I replied. Good, she said. Her voice softened slightly. That makes things easier. Another institutional confirmation. Logged. Filed. 2 evidence steps in a row, which meant pressure would follow. It arrived the next afternoon. Brent appeared at the house without warning. His truck pulled into the driveway with enough force to scatter gravel. He knocked once. Then again. Harder. I opened the door. He stood there with his phone in one hand, jaw tight. You're making a serious mistake, he said. I didn't invite him inside. We stood on the porch. The air smelled faintly like rain. The house is under contract, I said. That contract won't hold, he replied. His voice had lost the calm tone he usually used. We're filing a guardianship petition. There it was. The escalation Daniel had predicted. I watched Brent carefully. You can file anything you want, I said. But the closing will happen first. He stared at me. That's not how this works. It is, I replied. Until a court determines incapacity, the property owner retains full authority. I saw the recognition flicker across his face. He had heard the rule before. He just hadn't expected me to know it. That's when the moment settled into silence. Not a room this time, just the porch, but the quiet felt exactly the same. Brent exhaled slowly. You're destroying your relationship with your family. I thought about that sentence for a moment. Then I said something simple. My relationship with my family changed the day you brought paperwork into my kitchen. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked back toward his truck. The tires spun slightly as he backed out of the driveway. That evening, Daniel called again. They filed preliminary paperwork, he said. My stomach tightened slightly. But it's incomplete. Incomplete? Yes, he said. They don't have medical documentation. Without documentation, the petition couldn't move forward immediately. Procedure was slowing them down, which meant timing was still on my side. Closing day arrived earlier than expected. 2 weeks after escrow opened. 9:40 inches the morning. The conference room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. The buyers sat across from me, a quiet couple in their early 40s. They spoke politely but didn't ask personal questions. To them, this was a transaction. To me, it was a structural shift. Daniel placed the documents in front of me one by one. Deed transfer, settlement statement, title confirmation. The lawyer looked up and paused. Ready? He asked. I nodded. Then I signed. The pen moved slowly across the paper. One signature, then another. At 10:12 a.m., the house was no longer mine. At 10:14 m.m., the funds transferred. At 10:16 m.m., the leverage disappeared. I sat back in the chair, not relieved. Just aware. Daniel closed the folder. That should resolve the situation, he said. Resolve, another procedural word. I drove back to the house that afternoon. Technically, it was no longer my house, but the buyers had agreed to give me 48 hours before possession. Professional courtesy. I walked through each room slowly. The living room still smelled faintly of lemon oil from the furniture polish. The hallway creaked in the same spot near the stairs. In the kitchen, I ran my hand across the counter one last time. Then I packed what I needed. Passport, documents, a few clothes, my husband's watch, the jade teapot my sister had sent years earlier. Not much else. At 3:17 p.m., my phone rang. Tessa, I answered. We filed, she said immediately. The petition will be reviewed soon. I see, I replied. Then I added something quietly. That won't be necessary. What do you mean? She asked. I looked around the kitchen, at the empty counter, at the shadows of the maple tree outside. I sold the house this morning, I said. The silence on the phone lasted several seconds. You did what? I sold it. You're not legally stable enough to make that decision, she snapped. I was stable enough to sign. Brent's voice appeared again in the background. This will be challenged. I leaned against the counter. There's no asset to challenge, I said. You filed too late. The air on the other end of the line felt chaotic. You destroyed our future, Tessa said. No, I replied. I secured mine. I ended the call. That evening I left the keys on the kitchen counter. No note, no explanation, just the keys. When I drove away, the sun was setting behind the maple tree. The road stretched ahead in a long, quiet line. 2 states away, a small apartment, a different life. 4 months later, my days look very different. Quieter, simpler. I work mornings at a small bookstore that smells like paper and dust. I drink coffee from a chipped mug that says, "Still here." Tessa and I speak occasionally, carefully. The guardianship petition was withdrawn. Without the house, there was nothing left to control. Sometimes I stand on the balcony outside my apartment and watch the sun disappear behind the desert hills. And I think about that afternoon in my kitchen, when the blue folder first appeared. Some people mistake silence for permission, but silence can also be preparation. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Because sometimes protecting yourself isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply a signature on a quiet morning.